todo el mundo. Si les gusta lo que ven, déjenme un like, compartan, coméntenme qué les gusta, qué no les gusta. Revisen todo lo que promuevo en la descripción. Vamos a seguir viendo el video.
In this video, we're going to be talking about JavaScript variables and data types. And be sure to stick around till the end of the video because I have some challenges and some practice questions that you can use to apply the skills that you learned in this video. Before we start talking about variables and data types, I just want to mention that as we go through this series, I'm not going to be covering everything that there is to know about the JavaScript programming language. There are a lot of different features within JavaScript, a lot of built-in functions and syntax shortcuts and all sorts of things like that that you can do, but they're not absolutely necessary for you to write JavaScript code. For example, let me create a basic array here. So we'll say my array, and then we'll put some numbers in it. And this is actually what this video is all about, so don't worry if you don't understand this quite yet. But JavaScript has some built-in methods that we can use on this array. So we could say myArray.push, and then we can add a number to the end of this array. So just return the length of our new array, and if we print it out,
Vamos a revisar una cosa. El código y los resultados. Sí.
you can see that there's the
Ajá,
number
no
50
está.
at the end of it. Now, that is an example of a very useful and commonly used built-in JavaScript prototype method that we're going to be covering in this series. But there are other methods, and there are a lot of them, that we will not. So, for example, we can say myArray.reverse. Now, this one's pretty simple. All it does is it reverses the order of the items within that array, as you can see. But this is not critical for you to learn to write good JavaScript code and be a web developer. So I'm going to selectively exclude things like that and try to focus in on the most important things of JavaScript. Likewise, there are also some very complex topics that we can discuss around the internals of JavaScript and how it works behind the scenes and how prototypes work and why it's technically not a class-based language. And all of these things are important for you to understand later down the road, but when trying to get you from, zero to deploying your first full stack web application, they're not completely essential per se. And believe it or not, a lot of web developers that work full-time jobs and are employed getting paid lots of money don't fully understand the internals of JavaScript. And that's why this series called You Don't Know JavaScript, written by Kyle Simpson, or his GitHub username is Getify. And he's written this wonderful series or book series on JavaScript and how it works. And you can go to each of the series on GitHub and actually read.
Notas.
all about, how JavaScript works under the hood, and he has a tremendous understanding of this language and explains it in great detail. But I would say that you would use this as a reference, and personally, I think it's geared towards someone who has written JavaScript for some amount of time, and it's something that I reference back to even now after writing JavaScript for about 4+ years. It's still a great resource to look back on. So just know as we go through this series, I'm not going to be covering absolutely everything. And if you have questions, be sure to just Google it or go to this You Don't Know JavaScript series and pick the section you want to learn about and kind of read a little bit more about it. And finally, if I can get through this long intro, we'll finally get to variables and data types. But I want to show you one thing real quick, and that is the console.log statement. So when we're working within the JavaScript console in our Firefox DevTools, you can print a variable by using the console.log statement. And this is built into JavaScript. You can use it on the front end in the JavaScript console or the back end in the Node.js console. And we can print something like hello world. We've done this already once in a previous video, but this is how we print different variables. So if I just say my first variable and set it equal to 20 and then console.log that first variable, you'll see that it prints it to the console. That's going to be used heavily within this series, so I want you to be familiar with it. The next thing is the concept of comments. So if you put 2 forward slashes before your code and then you write something
Entonces,
this is obviously invalid JavaScript, and you press enter, it's not going to throw an error on you. While if you type it like this, it's going to say that there's a reference error because we haven't commented it out. There's another way to write comments. Let me clear the screen here. And you can put a forward slash and then a star, and then you can enter down, write whatever comments you want, and then you just have to close it out by a star and then a forward slash. And when we press enter, it's not going to yell at us with any sort of error because we have written a comment. So I just wanted to basically introduce those concepts, the console.log, the single line comment, and the multi-line comment. You're going to see them a lot, and they're very useful for marking up your code and remembering things about the code that you've written. A big congrats if you're still watching this video. It means that you are dedicated to learning how to code, and for that reason, let's jump into variables and data types in JavaScript. So when I think of a variable in JavaScript, I just think of a data container. And a good analogy for this is the Amazon warehouse. So they've got, let's jump into what means things about the code that you've written. A big congrats if you're still watching this video. It means that you are dedicated to learning how to code. And for that reason, let's jump into variables and data types in JavaScript. So when I think of a variable in JavaScript, I just think of a data container. And a good analogy for this is the Amazon warehouse. So they've got these big vertical yellow stacks of containers with with different products in them. And then on the bottom, they have little robots that kind of drive these containers around according to when the items in the containers are meant to be shipped. And I like to think of this as an analogy because JavaScript variables are very similar. In that Amazon warehouse, each container is registered and all the robots know exactly where to find the container and the products that are within that container. Same thing goes for JavaScript variables. Your computer knows exactly where to find all of these JavaScript variables that you declare and assign values to, and it's able to retrieve them instantly. So you can think of JavaScript variables as, you write them, and then they are basically like little Amazon products that get put into these containers and put in the back of the warehouse, but the computer at all times knows exactly where to go in that warehouse to find the values of these variables. In computer language, we wouldn't really call it a warehouse, we would just call it memory, but it's a good analogy to go by, and I think it'll help you remember what variables are all about. Just like Amazon's containers can have various types of products stored within them, so can JavaScript variables. And we can look at this here. We're going to just go through a couple examples of variables. The first one will be, we'll say your first variable, and we'll say learning to code gives you superpowers or something like that. So that would be one example of a variable, and that is actually a string variable. We'll go into that a little bit later. Now you can have your second variable, which will be equal to a number this time, so equal to 10. And finally, we'll say your third variable, and that'll be equal to an object. And we'll say that this object has a property that says something like hello world. And this is also a valid variable. And to print these variables, once again, we can use this console.log statement, and we can print your first variable, something like that, and you can see that it prints it out to the console. So these are just examples of writing variables, and now I want to go into each component of these statements. So as you can see, we have this keyword called const. We have a little space here. Then we have what seems to be our variable's name. Then we have this equal sign. Then we have some sort of data and a semicolon at the end. These are all really critical parts to writing JavaScript variables, because when the compiler goes to basically interpret the code that you have written, it reads it in a specific order, and it looks at every single what we call token within the code. So for example, if I tried to define a new variable, and this time I'll just say another hello world, something like that, this would be valid. But if we took out just even this single little quotation and pressed enter, it's going to give us a syntax error. And you're going to get a lot of these syntax errors when you first start out, because they basically say, hey, you haven't written this JavaScript program correctly. You've missed a specific token within your code. Now, a lot of times you don't have to actually worry about these syntax errors. What I have pulled up here is Visual Studio Code, which is a code editor we're going to work with a little bit later in the series. We're not there yet, but what I want to show you is that if we tried to say new variable, and then we define hello world with a semicolon at the end, it's going to look fine. But if we go over here and delete this little quotation, you're going to see that Visual Studio Code picks up on the fact that there's an error in this syntax. So a lot of the times when you're writing code, we're not going to see it, here in the console, which is what we're using right now. But once we get into code editors, it's going to point these things out, and you don't really have to worry too much about getting everything right as you're writing your code. The next thing we have to talk about with JavaScript variables is the concept of declaration and assignment. To properly use a variable, you have to do that sequence of steps in order. So you first have to declare the variable, then you have to assign a value to it. Now, if we typed in, something like new variable, and I'm going to actually refresh the page so we clear out all of the variables that we had already written. So if I say new variable, something like that, and we say hello world, that is going to not only declare but also assign this variable at the same time. So in many cases we're doing it simultaneously, but we can also break it out into individual steps, and we can do that by using the let keyword, and we'll say let another variable equal, we'll say 20 this time, or actually no, we need to just put a semicolon at the other end of it. And by doing that, we have actually declared the variable, and now we have to assign a value to it, and we don't have to put the let keyword at the beginning, we just assign a value. And we can print this to the console by saying another variable.
Hay una diferencia entre declaración y asignación. Primero se declara, net, una variable, y luego se asigna. Variable igual a 42.
And you can see that it equals 20. So in the second example, I declared it, then I assigned it. And it's important to understand this concept. You don't necessarily have to, think about this while you're coding, but I wanted to point this out. And it brings up another good point about this const versus let versus var keywords at the beginning of your variable expressions. Let me go ahead and write the same variable per se in 3 different ways. So first we can say variable 1 equals 10, and that's using the const keyword. Then we can say let variable, we'll say 2 this time, equals 10, that's valid. And then we can say var variable 3, can't type here, equals 10. And you can see that all 3 of these ways of writing a JavaScript variable are valid. So you might ask the question, well, how do we decide between const, let, and var? You need one of them at least to create a variable. If we just tried to say, random keyword and then variable 4 equals 10, it's going to give us an error because random is not an assigned keyword such as const, let, or var. Let's go ahead and start with var, and that is the only keyword that I would recommend against using. It's kind of a legacy keyword within JavaScript. It's something that existed in the old versions and standards of JavaScript, and nowadays we have the const and let keywords, which will pretty much cover every situation that we need to. Now, the reason var is not used anymore is because it can be redeclared. So if we say var my variable equals 10, and then we say var my variable equals, I'm sorry, I can't type today, equals 20, it's going to actually update the value of that variable without yelling at you at all. But if you use a keyword like const, so we'll say another variable equals 10, and then we say const another variable equals 20, it's going to say that there's a syntax error and it's going to yell at us for redeclaring a constant variable. With the var keyword, being able to redeclare a variable seems convenient, and it actually is when we're working within the console. But when you're actually writing code, it can be kind of dangerous and you can have some unwanted side effects by being able to redeclare a variable. The next keyword I want to talk about is let. And let is something that you will use whenever you expect to reassign a variable at some point in your code. So we just kind of talked about redeclaring a variable, and that's very different from reassigning a variable. So if you remember, you first declare the variable, which is basically saying, go back to our Amazon analogy where we're talking about, the containers and the robots have to remember where those containers are in the warehouse. Well, your computer has to first register or declare these variables, and then once it's declared, it kind of allocates
Mamá, estoy haciendo streaming. Estoy haciendo streaming, sí.
some memory space on the hard drive or something like that, or in RAM, to basically remember where to retrieve that variable from. So that's the declaration step. And then the assignment step is where we take an actual value and we say, okay, put this value in this variable, and so the computer will go find that variable that was declared into memory and assign your new value to that little memory slot. So we will always use let when we expect to reassign a variable. So let me show you what this basically looks like. So let's say
Vamos a traducir esto para decirlo de leer. Ah, diferencia de var. Const no cambia. No se puede reasignar.
that we have a counter and we start that counter at 0. And then we want to actually increase the value of that counter. So we can say counter equals counter plus 1. And we can also say counter plus plus. That will do the same thing as the previous line that I just wrote. So now we should have it equal to 2. And you can see that it is now equal to 2. And you can see that we are reassigning the value of this variable multiple times. Now, if we try to, let me refresh the page real quick so that we can use this variable again. And if we tried to say counter equals 0 with the const keyword, and then we tried to say plus plus, it's going to say that we have a type error because we can't assign or reassign a value to a constant variable. So that's when you want to use constants, is basically when you expect the value to never change. So a good example of that is, say we have a program that calculates some sort of I don't know, income statement. You want to put in a tax rate for this individual. So you might program in something like a tax rate, and that will be equal to 0.08 for 8%, and you press enter. And now this constant variable is never going to change. Your tax rate's never going to change. And that is the best use case for a constant variable. So just remember, you use let when you expect the value to be reassigned to a variable, and you use const when you expect the variable to never change values. Now, the concept of a constant is pretty universal in programming, and it spans across many languages. oftentimes you'll see constants written something like this. So we'll say tax rate equals 0.8%, and you can see that the variable has been written in all caps and separated by an underscore. Now, you'll see this very often, but this is just a semantic difference, and it's functionally the same as what we had written before. And that actually leads us into our next discussion, which is about variable naming conventions. I'm going to paste a couple different versions of variables in here, and we'll press enter, and you can see that all of these are actually valid in JavaScript. They're all written slightly differently, but they're functionally kind of the same. So these are all saying your first variable, but JavaScript recognizes them as different variables. That's why we're allowed to declare all of these at once. And they all functionally operate the same, but there are a couple of these that are more preferable in the JavaScript programming language than others. So for example, the first variable that we have here is written in something called camel case. And that is basically where the first letter of your variable is lowercase, and then each successive word or logical separated word within your variable is going to be capitalized. So this is called camel case, and then there's another version down here which is called Pascal case, which is basically where it's the same thing as camel case except the first letter is capitalized. The second variable here where we have underscores in between lowercase letters is called snake case. Then you have this one right here that we just talked about, which is called constant case. And then finally you just have a totally lowercase variable. And these are all different semantic styles that you can put on a JavaScript variable or any programming language variable. And oftentimes these indicate to other programmers something about your code. I'll talk about what these mean in just a second, but first I want to talk about what makes these valid. So you can really think of a variable in JavaScript kind of like a Twitter hashtag. So if you were to write a Twitter hashtag, and we'll say the full stack roadmap, which is the one that we have for this series, this would be a valid Twitter hashtag because it's all one word. Now, if I put a space here at the end, then Twitter's only going to recognize that first part, or full stack, and then it's going to treat roadmap as just normal text. And that's exactly how JavaScript works with variables. If we tried to define this as a variable, so let's say const full stack roadmap equals 10, it's going to give us a syntax error because we have a space in between these two words. To have a valid JavaScript variable, you have to put everything in one word and use one of these conventions up here at the top. Now, there's also a few things you can't do, so we cannot do something like this where we say full stack equals 10. You can't have these little quotes here. This is not going to work. And then you also cannot start a variable with a number. So you can see that I put 1 at the beginning of this variable, it's going to throw an error. But if I put full stack 1 at the end, so now we have our number at the end of the variable, that works just fine. So these are just some of the things to watch out for. It's fairly intuitive and you'll get the hang of this really quickly, and if you don't get the hang of it, the JavaScript debugger is going to yell at you and it's basically going to give you a bunch of syntax errors. Alright, so now that you know how to validly declare and assign a variable, let's talk about something called a style guide. And this goes back to the concept that we see up here where we have all these different semantic ways to write a variable. They all work, but some of them are more preferable than others depending on what language you're writing in and what you're trying to do with the individual variable that you're declaring. If you type in JavaScript style guide into Google, you'll find a couple different style guides by different companies. So this is Google's JavaScript style guide, and here would be Airbnb's JavaScript style guide. So basically what these are are specifications for the employees of these different companies that says, here is how we want you to write your JavaScript for our company. And what this might entail is different naming conventions, different use cases of different JavaScript features, all that kind of stuff. There's a plethora of things that you'll find within these style guides, but the one I want to look at is naming conventions. So we can find this within...
Bueno, dejemos hasta ahí. Ya tengo que ir a hacer otras cosas. Bueno, tengan un día genial. Si les gustó, déjenme un comentario de qué se les gustó. Si no me gustó, déjenme un comentario de qué les gustó. Déjenme el like, el dislike. Compartan. Revisen todo lo que promuevo abajo en la descripción. Hasta luego. Y los comentarios. Las notas están abajo. Hasta luego.